Hey everyone, who's up for a bit of a rabbit hole? Let's start out with the fact that Marvel are just now, in the year of our Lord 2024, making the X-Men woke. The nerve, right? Or at least that's the sentiment that flooded comic book spaces on YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit a week or two back, after Marvel released some new promotional materials for their upcoming X-Men 97 series, which is to serve as a continuation of the 90s animated show. And posts like this were coming from your rando internet users, from a lot of first-name bunch of numbers guys too, but we also saw a curiously large number of what seemed to be news articles and independent video creators expressing this sentiment. We saw those being shared in fan spaces, reposted, and cited as authoritative sources. I'm responding to this bout of anti-woke discourse with 3 videos. You don't need to have seen it before watching this, but the first was a short look at why Rogue's redesign isn't the smoking gun for a corporate plot to destroy femininity, released last week. The last one will take on the central idea that the X-Men wasn't woke and now is a little more directly. But for today's video, I want to look a little at how these sentiments were spread, by whom, in what form, and why. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll discuss many things and many people, but for a starting point, for a sample of what's going on here, what points are being argued, how those arguments are being made, and who's making them, I want to start with a deep dive into the article that popped up the most often for me while researching this discourse last week. No, Stan Lee and Chris Claremont didn't always intend the X-Men to be woke, from fandompulse.com. 1. The article. At first glance, Fandom Pulse looks to be rather anonymous a site, with something of a slapdash air to it. Your first hint that this isn't going to be a rigorous and comprehensively accurate piece comes right at the top, with a misattributed picture of Rogue. This is not, in fact, a still from X-Men 97, as I'm sure most of you are aware. It's from the 90s show. But what about the central claim, that this pair of X-Men writers didn't intend for the series to be woke? Well, to start with, what does woke mean here? It is rare to find a culture warrior offering a firm definition of the term. It's rare to find one with any definition, to be honest, and we're certainly not given one here. I've got a couple of videos from last year on my channel, which I'll link in the corner now, talking about the way this word's lack of definition is strategically leveraged by those moaning about wokeness, and we do see that here. By refusing to even gesture toward defining woke, which again is practically a floating signifier at this point, the article is able to abuse that vagueness and argue an exceptionally weak version of its supposed thesis that the X-Men of the Claremont era wasn't intended as a metaphor for queerness specifically, and that the Lee era wasn't intended to be a commentary on civil rights at its very beginning, without that modesty of ambition being obvious. It also bears mentioning that the titles focus on Lee and Claremont, 2 of the series' most famous and influential writers, yes, but far from its only ones, allows the piece to suggest it's arguing about X-Men comics as a whole, well, only actually having to consider the tenures of these 2 guys. So yes, the article's headline is borne out by the article's text. So long as we define woke in an exceptionally narrow and specific way, an argument is made that the X-Men were not, from the very beginning, consciously intended by Lee and Claremont to function as argumentative tools in favor of those very specific wokenesses. But how exactly is that argument made? Well, very poorly. At one point, the article writes that an allegory was never part of a script, and I know it's nitpicking to make the point that allegories are, by definition, never part of any script, but I feel it's worth picking that nit because the article doesn't seem to understand allegory more generally. A little later, it argues that the X-Men couldn't have been commenting on American race/civil rights issues specifically in the 60s and 70s because the giant-sized team came from all around the world. To argue that a portrait of racial harmony written by and for Americans in the mid-70s can't hold any allegorical weight simply because the characters making up that portrait aren't themselves American is to misunderstand not only the X-Men but allegory itself. Allegory can be obvious and direct, little more than a palette swap for whichever cause, figure, or idea the writer wishes to explore, or it can not be. It can be as indirect a metaphor as those writing it like. The Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings are both in part Catholic allegory. The latter's allegory operates in a fairly vague metaphysical sense, and the former's by asking the question, what if Jesus was a fucking lion? Oh, and for the cherry on top, the article compares the giant-sized characters to Star Trek, whose diverse cast was, of course, totally disconnected from any allegorical commentary on contemporary racism.
Planet is dead. There's nobody alive on Sharon because of hate. You both must end up dead. if you don't stop hating.
You're an idealistic dreamer.
That was sarcasm, by the way, in case any Fandom Pulse readers are watching. And it's probably worth making explicit another thing the article neglects to mention here, just quickly. Yes, Claremont's major contribution to the racial/civil rights reading was assembling that team, making a fairly indirect point, but his issues did sometimes just tackle these things literally, did make the allegory part of the script, as Fandom Pulse might put it. But it isn't just allegory. There's also the fact that the article has a fascinating habit of kinda going, nah. 4 separate times, the writer will bring up a point that the X-Men is woke side are supposedly making, often even mentioning the quote those defenses are built around, and then arguing without any counter-evidence, without any argument really, that those points are wrong. It's practically vibes-based debunking. It isn't even that all of the article's debunk attempts are made-up nonsense. Early on, the article argues against the idea that Professor X and Magneto were created to stand in for Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, by saying this was not true in the least, as the X-Men were simply created as another team book after the success of the Fantastic Four, using a familiar formula of a group of men with one beautiful woman for them to pine over. I know what the article's talking about here. There's a fairly similar quote from Stan Lee, which I'll play now.
I wanted to do another group of superheroes. But I was getting tired now of figuring out how they get their superpowers. I couldn't have everybody bitten by a radioactive spider or exposed to a gamma ray explosion. And I took the cowardly way out. I said to myself, why don't I just say they're mutants? They were born that way. We all know there are mutants in real life. There's a frog with 5 legs, things like that. So I won't have to think of new excuses. I'll get as many as I want, and yeah, he's a mutant, that's all.
The Fandom Pulse article is making a misleading point here. Lees also said that regardless of what he had in mind when coming up with these characters, it quickly became clear to him that the characters, setting, dynamics of the X-Men spoke to ideas like exclusion and bigotry.
I didn't create them to destroy racial prejudice, but once I had them going, it occurred to me, man, this strip makes a great vehicle to talk about racial prejudice and how terrible it is.
I thought it might be fun to get an analogy with the way some people are picked on by bigots and are persecuted by bigots.
And we can see the people behind the books realize and lean into this themselves very early on, but yes, in a bizarrely lazy move, even if the point it's trying to make is misleading, the article just doesn't give that quote. And of course, this example is the exception. Most of the dunks this article attempts couldn't be substantiated because they're not smart, none less so than the would-be money shot near the article's end. We're told Claremont didn't always intend the X-Men to be an LGBTQ stand-in, and he's quoted as saying, you know, there's a space between every panel, you can go wherever you want, and who am I to get in the way, before the article tries to manhandle those words into proving that the X-Men has nothing to do with, quote, that whole deviant sexualized lifestyle, by which, of course, Fandom Pulse simply means queer existence. The problem is, very obviously, that most queer X-Men readings are based on precisely what Claremont said here. The fact that the X-Men, particularly during his time, provide so receptive a canvas for any reader's minority experiences to be pulled out and examined upon. As Douglas Wolk writes in his book All of the Marvels, the genius of that mutant metaphor is that it applies to a whole lot of people in a very general way, enough to permit readers' identification with the X-Men as a group without applying completely and directly to anyone, but the mutant metaphor indeed applies a bit more directly to sexuality. If you're a mutant, you're born that way, although your difference/gift might not reveal itself until puberty or thereabouts. Again, we'll be getting more into this side of things during the next video, but yes, the article's framing of Claremont's response as an attempt to non-committally shut down the wild speculations of queer fans, instead of as essentially a blessing of that reader-centered, allegory-affirming interpretive process, is a wildly, heinously manipulative move, one which becomes so obvious if you just click the LiveJournal link the article itself uses to source this quote. But not only is it misleading to just focus on what Lee and Claremont intended, it's also misleading to just focus on what Lee and Claremont intended. Yes, they were the writers, but writers aren't the only ones who get to create characters, who characterize them, and so on. Case in point, let's talk just for a moment about Claremont's partner in crime, John Byrne, and a character they introduced together, Northstar. Coming out in the 90s, Northstar was Marvel's first openly gay character, and he originated in a late 70s X-Men issue by Claremont and Byrne. Claremont wrote that issue, of course, but Byrne was his creator. Byrne then developed him and the rest of Alpha Flight from one-issue figures to three-dimensional characters, and when asked, decades ago mind you, whether or not Northstar was intended to be gay all the way back in Alpha Flight issue 1, Byrne's answer was simple. Yes. Actually, it wasn't quite that simple. Byrne writes that the moment he consciously made this choice, he realized it was already there. Somewhere in the back of my mind, said Byrne, I must have been considering making him gay before I decided to do so. Of course, the temper of the times, the powers that were, and naturally the comics code would not let me come right out and state that Jean-Paul was homosexual, but I managed to get the word out even with those barriers. Returning to the article's big finish, which uses Claremont's own words to misrepresent him and follows them up with yet more opinion masquerading as fact, I hope it's now clear that even if this was true, that Claremont did not intend the X-Men to fit the article's exceptionally narrow conception of wokeness, to make this the point is to obfuscate the fact that other people besides Claremont did anyway. And obfuscate is the word. The man who wrote this article knows about Northstar, chose not to mention the character or his origin. He's a comics writer himself. The impetus behind this article, then, isn't an attempt to accurately report on the series or on the history of the X-Men. The writer's intention is to give a clueless reader a certain idea. The same general idea we've discussed before on this channel, of degenerate modern leftist ideals being forced into, corrupting older, pure media, and to half-heartedly tailor that idea to fit this new X-Men revival. And who is that writer? Let's talk about John Della Rose. 2. The context. John Della Rose is the leading Hispanic voice in science fiction. Wait, no, that's not right. John Della Rose is a YouTuber, Holocaust denier.
Millions of Jews and
Yeah, it was probably more like 300,000.
And writer of comic books, regular books, and until recently, of articles for Christo-fascist propaganda platform Bounding into Comics. More on them soon. He's also the writer of this Fandom Pulse article. And this one, and it seems this one, even though it's credited to Daniela Acera. He once accidentally showed himself logged into a Twitter account under that name. It's hard to be sure how many of the site's contributors are Della Rose sock puppets. It might be none, it might be lots more than none, but what is apparent is that Della Rose has been involved with this site ever since it launched, or perhaps relaunched back around December, and there's plenty of reason to believe it's his project entirely. See this Facebook group. Why this involvement? Why a website that manipulates quotes, obfuscates history, and centers a reactionary homophobic agenda so transparently? Well, that's kind of the easy part. John Della Rose is something of a known quantity. He has a reputation for libeling and harassing other writers and personalities in fandom spaces who disagree with him, even those who haven't done so directly. John Della Rose will probably see this video sooner or later, and he'll probably try some of this on with me, either in private or in the comments, so if you see him down there, it's probably not worth engaging. There's a webpage, which I'll link below, that hosts a partial, emphasis on partial, it's 6 years old, catalogue of the bad stuff he's done, and more evil shit has come to light since then, which I won't mention here because YouTube is YouTube, but it isn't hard to find. He's also, surprise surprise, an extremely vocal Trump supporter and is, by his own admission, far more radical than your average Republican. John's website, like much of his content, relies on getting enough clicks, enough converted, message-fearing consumers hooked onto the reactionary politics and the rage-fear cycle. He rails against agendas while having a far more tangible one than any X-Men writer, and as so politically outspoken a figure in the comic book space, he stands to benefit personally and professionally from the laundering and dissemination of far-right ideas that a site like Fandom Pulse facilitates. And I say a site like Fandom Pulse because, well, it is far from unique. The article we've been discussing got a little Twitter attention, getting shared and getting dunked on in equal measure, but Fandom Pulse is relatively new in the scene. The regular flow of content only really started late last year, and so when it comes to YouTube, when it comes to sympathetic creator voices citing articles in their anti-woke videos, Fandom Pulse is still a more minor player. You'll see it here and there. Yellowfash is no stranger to the site, for instance, but it isn't yet seriously competing with the classics, like the aforementioned Bounding into Comics. Bounding into Comics suffuses practically every new thing, woke, bad video on the site. It's here, and here it is again, just in X-Men 97 videos, and if you've seen any of this content in the past, if you've watched any of my videos on YouTube Chuds even, you'll doubtless recognize the name. This isn't new, but you might not know the history, and that is worth breaking down just quickly. The site was created by this guy, John F. Trent, then a media manager for an online advertising company named Intermarkets. This was a decade or so ago, and Bounding into Comics was originally practically a blog, a hub for Comicsgate-related news items and discussions, before Trent saw the potential for, let's say, conservative-tinged comic book takes on the internet of the mid-2010s. And so Bounding into Comics took on the style of a bona fide news site, and in 2017, Trent, now styled as the site's editor-in-chief, managed to convince his then boss, Intermarkets Kevin Lucido, to buy the site and add it to his side project, Aurora Media Incorporated, a small network of clickbaity, right-leaning trash news sites. And if that's given any of you deja vu, it's probably because you're recognizing Lucido and Intermarkets from their real claim to fame, serving as the long-time advertising partners for the infamously biased Drudge Report, which, fun fact, is also the place where Andrew Breitbart got his start. Lucido's Drudge partnership wasn't a standard, run-of-the-mill business thing either. No, he'd written in as a reader to pitch a better monetization method. Oh, and it's not a one-off either. Per Buzzfeed News, Lucido's Intermarkets also represents other conservative publishers. Worth noting, maybe. But yeah, now Bounding into Comics had backing, and this was right around the time that a bunch of our other favorite guys in this space started getting more and more success, scaling up production and so on. Probably a coincidence, but who knows. Bounding into Comics' editorial bias is an open secret. Whereas many anti-woke creators will hedge on this front, will give some variation of the claim that they're not against feminism, tolerance, so on, rather they're simply against media including any messaging, and it's just a coincidence any messaging they detect and complain about is broadly progressive in nature, something like that, Trent is helpfully upfront. He clarified in a recent YouTube interview with MasterSwagKing that his mindset, and therefore Bounding into Comics mindset, at least while he was in charge, was one that accepted the fact any work will contain messages, and opposed specifically those messages his austere and patriotic Catholic self considered immoral.
I think a lot of it has to do with just telling good stories and telling stories that promote good values. And I know people want to say like, oh, I just don't want any kind of messaging in my films. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous.
This is why you can find old Bounding into Comics articles which condemn women wearing revealing dresses in demonological terms. And that MasterSwagKing interview also saw Trent give some further examples of what would fall under this umbrella, like homosexual activity and women's reproductive rights.
People are going to be kind of fooled by the production value. So it's like, oh, it's really well made, the story's really well done, but it's like, well, it's literally telling you that gay sex is good though. So things like that, if that makes sense. Or it's like killing this child is a good thing.
Riding the chud boom in the wake of The Last Jedi and through COVID, Bounding into Comics was able to establish maybe the thickest facade of legitimacy of all similar websites, through a combination of longevity, exposure, and the simple act of using terms and forms associated with traditional news media, always an effective shortcut to borrowed legitimacy. The site was able to use this to do many things, like pushing the homophobic groomer panic, like playing defense for white nationalists like Vox Day, and yes, like providing sources that scan at a glance as legitimate to be flashed on screen behind practically every member of the then rising, now current class of right-wing YouTube commentators. Oh, and also like paying out to Trent and the site's owners. Don't forget, the people behind Bounding into Comics are pros, literally at monetizing this type of thing as effectively as possible. Anyway, that was all going fine until a few months ago, October, November time, when Trent found out from Aurora that bounding into comics was to be taken in a different direction editorially. But yeah, Trent left, started his own knockoff, which, surprise surprise, is already getting cited in Thing Woke videos, and set himself up as another one of those capital letters, angry title YouTube guys. Looks like it's going well for him. Hey, isn't this also the time that John De La Rose unceremoniously stopped writing for Bounding into Comics and started Fandom Pulse? Could it be he was either turfed out to help clean up the site's image, or, like Trent, chose to strike out alone in order to keep being more blatantly bigoted? Nah, right? This shift, though, is likely why Bounding into Comics pieces on the X-Men going woke are less inflammatory than the other bits and bobs we've been looking at in this video. Why, while it's still clearly partisan, still clearly manipulating the narrative to stoke rage, it's doing so a little less overtly than many of the articles predating that editorial shift did. It appears someone at Aurora, perhaps Lucido, perhaps not, wants that veneer of respectability being preserved, wants plausible deniability intact. Its reputation continues, hence all those guest spots in videos, but, as always, there are others less concerned with hedging. See, for instance, the last major news piece that did the rounds, this one from The Blaze. I'm going to save a more detailed look at the contents of this Blaze article, like the idea that non-binary people all popped into existence at some point in the last couple of decades, for a more focused discussion in the future. This piece is a good example of the type of criticism I'll be focusing on in that last part of my woke X-Men video triptych, but I do want to note that this is another prominent news-style outlet being shared and consumed during outbreaks of nerd discourse, and to note that like Fandom Pulse and John De La Rose, like the growth of Bounding into Comics out from an online monetisation company, Blaze's reporting is not a neutral, disinterested examination of pop culture, because this is Blaze. The Blaze that gave Tomi Lahren her start before her Fox tenure. The Blaze involved with Proud Boys founder Gavin McInnes. The Blaze that was founded by and is still indirectly owned by Glenn Beck, the conservative pundit, the birther. Yet again, trace the new media went woke fear-mongering back far enough, and you get to a conservative who financially benefits from that culture warring success. But that isn't quite where the connection game ends. We can continue. It's little things at first. Quarter Black Garrett, Chud stream regular, who longtime viewers of the channel will recognize from his Gigabrain Blue Beetle takes, got his start on Louder with Crowder, which was on Blaze. Or take current Blaze big shot Alex Stein. He's actually someone you might have seen before. Do any of you remember the infamous video where RK Outpost's Ryan Kinnell, who we've also discussed before on this channel of course, went to Universal Studios and made that hilarious George Floyd joke?
Hey Alex! Alex, come here! They have a memorial to George Floyd. Oh my gosh! George Floyd Memorial Live!
Well, that's Blaze's Alex Stein with him. And guess who else they went to the park with that day? Yes, that is Jeremy Griggs, the man behind Geeks and Gamers, who is, incidentally, the only one of these guys to have a shred of self-awareness.
Welcome to every video we make. We use one little thing and then we build the narrative out of it. Don't act like that's not what we do.
I don't build a narrative, I do
what we do. You've made the same fucking video on the same topic at least 7 times a week, Ryan. And you're gonna act like we don't do that.
I talk about, yeah, I talk about
says one fucking thing and we make a whole video out of it. That's what we do.
Both of these guys are, of course, stream regulars, popping up routinely on podcasts like Nerdrotic's Friday Night Tights, which, come to think of it, Stein's been on too, or the Critical Drinkers Open Bar, or even EFAP. Hey, what's Mauler doing here? Or take another figure that unites Nerdrotic's corner of the grifter sphere with the drinkers, Turning Point USA's Benny Johnson, the bloke responsible for that clip of weapons-grade cringe that did the rounds the other week.
Go away now.
Tough town, boys. What you have?
No prizes for guessing which Glenn Beck-founded site he used to work for, or which ex-Drudge partner's outfit he also used to work for. Or take Eric July, who some of you might recognize from my Spider-Verse video, and from being one of the big Miles Morales isn't Spider-Man guys. He is openly a contributor for Blaze Media. It's all connected. Her web connects them all. And back when Eric was making his name, he was also pushed heavily by John F. Trent, who's now signal-boosting De La Rose and Fandom Pulse, and who streamed with Nerdrotic, who himself, yep, streamed streamed with Eric and Ryan and Garrett and Benny and Gavin and climate change denier Russia simp Republican presidential hopeful Vivek Ramaswamy, who himself was on Glenn Beck's podcast with Eric, and Jesus Christ, it just keeps going. And shit, you guys, when I say in my videos that propagandistic content like this, like the videos, like the news-style articles that's wrong or misleading and transparently prioritizes its political, often fascistic narratives above whatever pop culture it's pretending to care about and wrapping those narratives around, is made and pushed and substantiated and coordinated by people who stand to gain personally and financially from the indoctrination of uninformed viewers and from the advancement of right-wing political projects, this is what I mean. So as we reach the end of our time, let's reflect. This is a video about one article and the dodgy claims it makes, but it's also a video about where that article came from, and about the way a piece of writing can assume the semblance of legitimacy simply by being an article. It's a video about the idea that people with agendas and vested interests know and use this fact. And it's a video about the idea that some of these articles, some of these sites, and some of these people are a little more connected than it might at first seem. And look, I'm not saying all the YouTube channels and websites I don't like are paid operations by far-right dark money working in lockstep to systematically brainwash the public, but I am saying that if that's 100, and if 0 is the claim that every one of the figures I've discussed here is producing authentic, organically written work off their own back and in the best possible faith, that they're all totally unaffiliated with right-wing organizations, institutions, and figures, we are not at 0. And the fact that the truth is probably nearer, say, 50 than 0 is practically a matter of public record. And I am saying that you too can do what I've done here. Pick one seemingly discrete unit of anti-woke outrage and look further and further into who's behind it, what it's actually claiming, and see that 9 times out of 10, it is just bullshit, all the way down. A few last things before this video ends, though. First, I probably ought to note that a couple of the people I've mentioned in this video seem a little litigious, so if this video is suddenly gone one day, that may well be the reason. And if you know anyone who you think could do with seeing this video, maybe shoot them a link sooner rather than later. Second, sites like Fandom Pulse, and for that matter, Trent's new project, That Park Place, they're still trying to get big, so if you see them in the wild, try not to click or engage. Even if you've got the best dunk known to man, ultimately, that does help them too. Third, I'd like to say a big thank you to the guys over at the Fandom Initiative for pointing me in the right direction with some of this video's research, especially Nothing But Media and Actual Fandom. The latter, I believe, has a kinda related video coming out soon about X-Men 97 discourse, so go keep an eye out for that. And last, unlike some people, there are no shadowy financiers backing me, except you guys. So if you think videos like this are good and worthwhile, if you want to help make sure I'm able to keep making them, and if you want to get a bunch of cool perks, do consider joining up, either on Patreon or with a YouTube membership, like the fine folks on screen now have. So thanks to all of you for watching, special thanks to my supporters, especially Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Karen Kuhlman, Magath, Ryan Emily, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy. Please subscribe, I beg, we're so close to 100k, and I'll see you all soon-ish for Woke X-Men Part 3.